What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Yala. Alright, coming up next, it is part 2 of our conversation with Sudhir.
And it gets heavy, man. It gets heavy.
I mean, we didn't even plan to have a part 2, but we started the recording, things were flowing, we were going deep, and there's so much that we unpack in this episode as well.
Okay, don't wait already. Just listen to the episode.
One thing that you did mention in your points about like, okay, like how to the racism is never ending challenge. You brought up the thing about racial harmony. Quite a few of the questions we got were around the thing of like, okay, you know, there are things like CMIO, right? There's things like SAP schools. There's things that feel like, okay, it's affirmative action, but could this be almost harming or making it more difficult to see everyone as Singaporeans? If right from the start, right, you have these different segmentations. Is it time we do away with it? Is it more productive or destructive? Are there alternative forms that we can put in place?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
He just flipped the page.
Yeah, he just flipped the page. Hey, he already said it must come from the head. Yeah. No, he flipped the page in his mind.
In my mind.
Waiting for you to ask.
Like, okay.
No, I'm really interested here.
So CMIO, I have a lot of thoughts
Okay.
And I don't want to get too technical. I actually gave a talk on top-down versus bottom-up models of identity. So CMIO is a top-down model, right? The state decides what are the categories and they fit people into those categories. So places like Singapore and China have like these top-down models. You know, China went through a very elaborate exercise in the 1950s to come up with its, I think, 56, what they call minzu. Again, I'm probably pronouncing that wrongly, but minzu, yeah. So they came up with, you know, the Han being one of them, and there are 55 others, and that also was a process of like whittling down the many hundreds of different possible identities, especially in places like Yunnan where they had, you know, hundreds and hundreds of identities. They whittled everything down to 56. So different countries have gone through this process of like having this top-down identity model. And there are many other countries who have a bottom-up model, right? Including places like India, including many places in Western Europe. That's why, you know, if you meet people, you know, from Western Europe and they come here, I've traveled with friends through Malaysia and in Singapore. They'll be like, "Hey, why everybody asks you what race you are?" You know, it's such a weird question for people, especially in Western Europe, especially given their experience after the war. Right, and how race was such a big part of World War II and coming out of that. You know, for a lot of them, there's what they call more of a universalizing model, right? So in France, especially, you know, universalizing model, you're just a French citizen. We're not going to ask for your race, religion, all this other stuff, right? And
so that's what you mean by bottom up.
Yeah, so that, you know, it's the state does not.
The state is blind to it.
The state does not ascribe an identity to you,
And if people want to cluster up and all, that's almost like the free market equivalent of society.
Yeah, and policies are not run by any of these indicators, You know, in Singapore, policies are run by these indicators, right?
Yeah.
Your mother tongue, your self-help groups, your mandakis, all this kind of thing. There are a lot of policies, the HDB ethnic quotas. Policies are run by this, you know. Whereas in these other countries, policies are not run by these indicators, right? Race and religion and things like that. But something very interesting is happening. And, you know, I go into it a lot more detail in this talk I gave at a conference 2 years ago, and we can add the link onto your podcast show. People want more. But over the past few years, you're seeing countries with this bottom-up model actually realizing that, hey, maybe we do need to start asking about these attributes like race. So actually, there's a big discussion happening now in France because, you know, the problem is that researchers have found that you're actually finding pockets of discrimination, right? So like people from North Africa, people from Sub-Saharan Africa, who are obviously French citizens now, having trouble with the rental market, you know, having trouble with employment, perhaps being discriminated against, and there's no real way to track it. Because, you know, the state doesn't actually assess and measure and count ethnicity and religion. So the question is, why do some countries like Singapore and China have this top-down model where we actually put people into buckets? It's partly administration, right? It's to be able to address the interests of different groups. And the problem with the opposite model, again, is that if you claim that there's no such thing as race, right, then how do you even deal with the issue of racism? Because if race doesn't exist, does that necessarily imply that racism doesn't exist?
Yeah.
And so I think what I want to say on CMIO is that essentially there's a lot of tension around the world about whether we need to actually include race in our census, whether we need to account for race, whether we should let people self-identify, or whether we should actually ascribe a race to people. In my view, CMIO in Singapore might have been useful in our early days, 20, 30 years, maybe 60s to the 90s. I think it's I mean that purely from an administrative point of view, lah. Okay, we need to organize society. We need to have these different buckets. Make sure nobody gets left behind. So let's have this model. But I think it's long outlasted its usefulness. And the problems with CMIO, I mean, there are many. The obvious one is with forcing people into these straitjackets, lah. These identity straitjackets. Why and then ascribing different attributes. Why is an Indian associated with Tamil, right? The Tamil language. There's so many other Indians. There's so much diversity within Indian. There's so much diversity within Chinese, within Malay, within all the groups.
Yeah.
But then there are also other problems aside from the identity problem, which have to do with HDB quotas and things like that, which I'll stop now because I've been droning on, but I'm happy to talk about other problems as well with CMIO. I actually think it should be dismantled as soon as we can.
But any replaced by something else that has more buckets or no buckets at all?
I feel no buckets. I feel that the main rebuttals I get to, if we get rid of CMIO, what are we going to do for our self-help groups, right? If because Mandaki looks after the poor Malays, Sinda looks after the poor Indians. If you get rid of this system, right, who's going to look after the poor, those left behind, lah? But I think it's very easy to set up organizations that are just focused on people on their social economic status, but right? It doesn't have to be race-specific help. I don't see the need for that.
But even when going back to that argument that people use against the dismantling of CMIO, where how are these self-help groups or help groups supposed to ascribe to a particular ethnicity, lah?
Yeah.
I mean, just because you dismantle CMIO doesn't mean I will forget that I'm Indian, right? So or are they saying that if you dismantle CMIO, identity or ethnicity is taken out of the picture, so something like a Sinda has no more value? But people still could identify as Indians themselves. How do they justify that argument? Or is there no way to prove that I'm Indian? Like anyone who's dark skinned could say, "Oh, I'm Indian. I want to be part of Sinda." Is that the fear?
Own self-declare.
Because that to me is like...
I think the fear is that the funding of these organizations might go down, lah. I think that's the main fear.
Funding, yeah.
Not that the people who need the help will not know where to look. Or
the funding. Okay.
I suspect that's the main issue. Because a certain amount taken from our CPF and directed, right?
Based on our ethnicity. La.
So I think that's the main fear.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think, my view is we can have a slow dismantling and during the transition period, we just make sure that we look out for people falling through the cracks, lah, because of funding shortfalls and things like that. I'm sure there are ways before we get to a stage where all our civil society organizations are not focused on race, right?
Yeah.
That we're helping people based on social economic status.
Yeah.
So I don't see the need for the CMIO system. I know many disagree. But yeah, I think it's long outlived its usefulness.
But why not, like what Harish said, adding more categories, like, mix, Indian, Chinese, mixed parentage or something. So it is still indicated there, lah. And you can, I know others as a bucket is just way too big and too, no definitions about it, lah. But what if we have more categories? Because like what you said about France as well, I've seen firsthand. Like I was literally there when the riots were happening, the racial riots, and then you walk through the banlieues, and they're like ghettos are basically. It's you can tell when you've gone from the French suburbs into the outskirts of the banlieues and all. And then I mean the ban on religious insignia in schools that causes even more anger and causing beheadings in France. Like specifically because they say that there should not be any display of any religion in the classroom. It's a secular space, so they ban the hijab. They ban the wearing a cross to school. But the hijab is a much more visible expression of your religion. But because of that, things like that, it stokes a lot of anger in people who are religious, and it causes them to take very violent extremist measures because they feel that their religion has been overlooked as well, or just forced into a box that they don't want to be in. So in some ways, just giving people a space or giving them a category and all that. I know it sounds like it's putting people in a box, but in some ways it's your box. It can also feel it's your space to play within. Wouldn't that also be an alternative to dismantling it entirely?
So that's I think a valid response which some people have, that CMIO actually protects the identities of minorities better than than a system that has no buckets at all.
Yeah.
My feeling is that there might be I would be more swayed by that argument if we were a much bigger country and we were not just a global city, and so if you do the comparison to a place like France, for example, the banlieues there, a lot of people who live there are descendants of North Africans, the former colonized of the French, right?
Yeah.
It's a very different dynamic to the Chinese, Malay, Indians, others in Singapore. There's no former colonizer and former colonized, firstly.
Yeah.
The second thing is that we are so much more integrated for now 200 plus years, right? There's been so much more intermixing, despite what the likes of Boon Lee would like to believe. There's been so much more intermixing, and the vehicle I always use to describe it is our food. If you look at our food, right, that there's just been such a long history of mixing in Singapore that the idea that we actually need fixed categories and then fixed quotas in housing estates in order to make sure people don't fight, which is essentially the theory. I feel that it's, funnily enough, paradoxically enough, it's actually the conservatives borrowing ideas from overseas and fixing it onto Singapore. I don't think we should have the fear of that. I think we're a global multicultural city. Even if we didn't have quotas, even if we didn't have the CMIO system, I think people would get along just fine. I mean, of course, there'll be some issues every now and then, as we've seen over the past week. But I don't buy the argument that it's CMIO and the ethnic quotas in housing blocks that are actually protecting us and making us safer. I don't really buy that argument.
Then what about the stuff like SAP schools? Because I mean, all I know of SAP schools is that they are special assistance program.
Yeah,
so it's almost like it's quite a prestigious thing to get into a SAP school. But from what I read, most of the SAP schools tend to cater to the Chinese language. Like you need to know Chinese to get into a SAP school.
Yeah.
And I know there have been certain debates and articles. I think Rice Media had something saying that as long as SAP schools exist, there will be some sort of discrimination. So those sort of things that isn't that a racist policy? Or when it comes to policy or within the setting of Singapore, those sort of things are not racist, or do they do more to propagate? Because CMIO touches like everyone, right? But SAP schools is almost like, is this offshoot? Does it make it less of a problem? Does it contribute to the problem?
I think, I haven't read nearly as much as I should on this issue, but I have read the Rice piece.
Yeah.
And I think, SAP schools, there is an element of Chinese elitism which
Yeah.
the SAP schools contribute to.
Yeah.
Whether the connection between that and CMIO may be a bit tenuous, but yes, the short answer is we need to get rid
Of these sort
of any educational policies that give preference to one language group over another. So if there are special schools, there should be special schools for all mother tongues, right?
So then the example you gave just now, where it was, you said 2 years ago, or was it more recently? You're saying there are discussions in France where they are identifying problems where the policies like minorities fall through the cracks, right? So are they now considering more top-down approaches, or
Yeah. So I think the two places I've read about are Portugal and France, which both are considering more assessment and counting of people by race, basically. Yeah.
so that means it's almost they are kind of like moving towards the CMIO.
Yes.
CMIO model.
They're thinking of more, or maybe not necessarily force-fitting people into buckets, but certainly assessing and measuring and addressing issues based on people's origins and race.
Okay. So I mean, because like quite a few of our commenters were talking about the differences between Singapore and other countries, and I know on the previous podcast with you, one question that we had from a listener was about how the future PM of Singapore should think about immigration when it comes to Singapore. And I know your response was that we can't look at Singapore the same way we would look at like a bigger country, which is what you alluded to previously, right? Because you're saying Singapore is a global city, right?
Yeah.
So on that note, right, how would you say, I know previously also you said you're fairly optimistic about Singapore, that we should never think about what's the worst that could happen because you believe in more for Singapore, right? Fuck, I just lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
What was I getting at?
No, but I'll chime in with something while you're getting that, which is that I think we have a tremendous risk aversion when it comes to a lot of issues, and so even with issues like race, right? So I'll say, I don't think we need the CMIO, I don't think we need HDB quota, but baked in there for me is that issues like what happened over the past couple of weeks. We just have to learn to deal with it, This is life, These are tensions, these are frictions that you have in a multicultural society. It's far more important to build our resilience, to build our methods of dialogue and discourse, rather than to try to think, we can reach a point where we'll get these to zero. We'll never have these incidents. Which I think is actually the frame of mind of a lot of people. It's very, we need to fix things such that we have zero racial incidents. But I think that's the wrong way to think about things.
Well, that echoes what Kelvin Cheng posted. He basically said racism is everywhere. Even in Singapore, there will be racist acts, and the difficult thing is when people start to classify everything as a racist act. That's what he was saying. He didn't say specifically whether it's the PA incident or the Sarah Baghrib incident.
But I mean, he alluded to that.
I mean, it is obviously
off the back of that.
Yeah, off the back of that.
I mean, what you said, and I realized where I was going with my previous thought is that right now, Singapore, we have all this embedded, as much as we have embedded policies to protect minorities, we also have things like Racial Harmony Day. We have this thing of a pledge, regardless of race, language, or religion. Do you think that gives an easy outlet for politicians to say, this is not what we stand for? To immediately kind of identify or label these issues that happen as one-offs because this is not what Singapore stands for. Because for me, when, let's say, Shanmugam said, I think the past week in reference to the Dave Prakash video, he's surprised, he always thought Singapore was leading towards more racial harmony, and this surprised him. And in my mind, are you fucking kidding me? How is that a surprise? It feels like this thing has been bubbling up for long. But then I look at Racial Harmony Day, the pledge and all this stuff that shows Singapore to be cohesive. And now I think maybe that itself needs to go. Our pledge needs to be regardless of race, language, or religion, bearing in mind there will be asshole racists out there, and everything needs to be extended because I also believe that racism will never be totally eliminated. Maybe it's things for those to change. Time is for those to change as well.
Yes, to some degree, I agree. The big official symbolic things like the pledge, the national anthem is something I frequently talk about because that's a classic example of a cultural artifact that once a year. When I say cultural artifact, I mean the little bit of Malay that people can speak. Many of them not even understanding what the words mean, so they'll just go off Mali kita da 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 and they don't know what they're saying. For many people, it's a sort of cultural artifact that they can dust off once a year, August 9th, spit it out, and wear that as a badge of honor. Hey, I can speak some Malay. Our national anthem is in Malay. We must be multicultural. How dare you call us racist, right? Yes, and I think there's an interesting concept in psychology called moral license, and Malcolm Gladwell has a very good talk on this, which again we can put the link to. But essentially, moral license is when you do something for a particular group that essentially makes you feel better about yourself, and then that excuses future actions that may actually prejudice that group. Right? So you have this moral license to then act in a different way. So issues like tokenism play into this, and I think Gladwell, he mentioned this example in the 1800s when the British royal family commissioned a painting by a female artist because all the art was dominated by men, and they commissioned one piece by a female artist to be hung in their palace or whatever, and after that was the end of it, right? They went back to having men only, but that one piece allowed them to say, hey, no, we're gender neutral, right? And I think in Singapore there's a lot of that idea of moral license where because we've done A, B, C, D, E for the Malay language and for Indians and for minorities, okay, that allows us to forget about all the other stuff that might be going on. And so I think that's something we need to understand. I think when it comes to people like Shanmugam and the government talking about racial issues, I think it gets back to what I was saying about we really need to confront our history. Because I also was surprised by Shanmugam's comments because, the first thing I'm like, haven't you read what Lee Kuan Yew himself has said all these years? Don't you see the link between some of these policies that are in place? Giving preferences to Chinese for immigration, right? Singapore has a unwritten but spoken policy to maintain a Chinese supermajority. I've called it before the most racist policy in the developed world. Right? Essentially, at the border, we give preferences to Chinese.
It's still going on now?
Yeah, it's still going on. And it was confirmed in Parliament in 2012, I think. It's one of these unwritten policies. Lee Kuan Yew first talked about it in the 80s when he said that Singapore's... So in the 60s, let me just backtrack. In the 60s, Lee Kuan Yew professed that Chinese are genetically superior or East Asians are genetically superior to others. He did this in a little anecdote about a mom going to the hospital and surviving or not surviving.
That was when was this, in the 60s?
I think it was 67.
Okay.
So that he told this anecdote about the East Asian goes to the hospital.
And I know you wrote about it in an article, right? So I'll put that link in the show notes as well.
Because he was the eugenics and everything back then was a big thing, right? It wasn't isolated to Lee Kuan Yew itself, the belief in that you put two people of superior genes together, and then you will continue producing superior genes. So I just wanted to ask whether was that a product? Was he a product of his time, or was it just him as a person based on what he was reading and what he was exposed to at Cambridge or what?
I think many people, when it comes to issues around his views on race, I think many people have said he's a product of his time. I've heard that used a lot.
Okay.
So, whether you want to use that as an excuse or defense, I don't know. But the reality was he had very racist views. whether others around him had those views or not, it's hard to say.
So maybe you can just go into a bit of that, because I know that was like the 6th point in your what you talked about previously, and I know you've written about it. But when I read that article of yours, also I was like, oh shit, he really said that. Maybe what were some of the things specifically that he said that you think we should go back and confront or dissect as part of this broader discussion on race in Singapore?
Okay, so I think it's important. The late 60s, he articulated his views on the genetic superiority of East Asians. Okay, this was done through an anecdote, and we can share that anecdote later. So where he put, I think, East Asians on top, and then Southeast Asians and South Asians below them. Then in the 80s, he made a very interesting couple of statements in Parliament, where he said that this is where he referred to the cultural superiority of Chinese with regards to economic development. Okay, so he said the reason Singapore is successful, and I'm paraphrasing, we can put the exact quote in something along the lines of, the reason Singapore is successful is because we had a majority, and it's because that majority is Chinese.
Yeah,
that's why we were successful. So this is actually in Parliament in the 80s, and he used that. I think everybody assumes that this was the justification for giving preferences to ethnic Chinese migrants to come in from the 90s, especially places like Hong Kong, because people were leaving Hong Kong before 97. So that was one of the reasons. Let's ramp up our immigration. And give preferences to Chinese, and that's also when they were realizing that the birth rates of Indians and Malays are higher. So if we don't actively engineer the population, the Indian and Malay shares will grow higher and higher over time. Right? And because Singapore is successful, because it's Chinese, we need to maintain Chinese. And this has been an unwritten policy, but it was confirmed in 2012 in Parliament. And I can attach the quote as well by one of the ministers in Parliament. Confirmed that yes, Singapore does give preferences to ethnic Chinese in terms of immigration. So this is, in my view, like this whole strand of Lee Kuan Yew's thought, right? If you go back to the 60s where he talked about the genetic superiority and then the cultural superiority and actually enacting it into a firm policy. And this is probably the most racist policy that Singapore has, and like I said, it's the most racist policy in the developed world, because essentially it sends a signal to society that we are successful because we're Chinese we're Chinese majority, right? The other races should always be minorities because forget what's going to happen if they ever grow bigger. Singapore will be destroyed, and different people have different responses. Some people say, no, it's about political stability, having one, one big race and other smaller races is actually lends itself to political stability, as opposed to having, two ethnic groups, both with 40+%, that makes for a much more volatile, combative situation. Apologists for this policy will come up with all kinds of excuses, right? But ultimately, I think it's by definition a racist policy. I don't think any of the arguments or rebuttals really hold much water. I think this is, it cuts to the core of one issue with racism for minorities in Singapore, is that we call ourselves a multicultural global city. We profess these aspirations towards harmony regardless of race, religion, but in practice it's not the case, right? So there's a huge disconnect. I often have this argument with people. They're like, oh, you think America or Canada or Australia is better? Is it the racism? Then I said, no, I don't think racism is less there, but I do think they're more honest about it. I do think they're more honest about it. They probably have a much bigger challenge than we do, but they're talking about it. We are living under this fake bubble of like, oh, let's forget about what Lee Kuan Yew said back in the past. Let's forget about all these racist policies. And I think that's what I tell people. In Singapore, it's not that racism at an absolute level is really bad compared to other places. But the disjoint, right? The disjoint between what we say we are they were a wonderful multicultural paradise, and the reality of it. So that I think that's the main thing we have to tackle. There are other prejudice policies. The other big one is with Muslims in the armed forces, which for sure we should have changed that 20 years ago. I went to the armored regiment. I don't know what were you guys in?
I was infantry.
Guards.
So in your regiments, were there Malays and Muslims or Malay Muslims?
God lah. Yeah, God.
Also, to very specifically answer one of the questions that was posed to you, they asked, well, are there Malays in machine gun units? I was a machine gun commander, and absolutely yes. There were other machine gun commanders also who were Malays. My own machine gun assistant.
But their machine gun no bullets.
Okay.
No, strong. They're big and strong, got a lot of bullets. No, so yeah. I think there's some outdated views that there's no guards or commandos who are Malay at all lah. Yeah.
There are some outdated views, but there are some that are on the money lah.
Yeah.
So I was in armor.
Yeah.
There wasn't a single Muslim in armor.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Wow.
When I was there.
Okay.
So I got to be careful. Sometimes there's a lot of conflation of Malay and Muslim. It's actually I think it's no Muslims allowed,
Muslim, okay.
right? So there's no Muslims allowed.
Yeah.
Armor seen as the front line. Our enemies being Malaysia and Indonesia supposedly, and so there are no Muslims allowed in armor.
I mean, even statistically, if you look at leadership positions within army, it is not representative of our population at all lah. So I think there might be some views that are inaccurate, but I think there are the numbers to back up the general sentiment lah.
So that's why I'm just saying that it's good like if we were more open about all these numbers and everything as well.
Yeah.
And I think there've been publications, but they've not really discussed about it lah. Like that. I mean, there was the last one was about the Muslim cookhouses in naval ships. I think they were saying that it's a logistical issue. That's why cannot have Muslim on a navy ship lah, which makes zero sense to me. Yeah. But anyways, sorry.
Yeah. No. So exactly, we need much more clarity on these issues, and we need to get to the bottom of why Muslims are in certain units and not in certain units. But it's not very healthy for our unity. It's not healthy when it comes to issues like racial harmony. Throughout my 2 years there were jokes made about Malays. No Malays around. Jokes made about Malays, and also there's the connection to Malaysia lah. So Malaysia is our big enemy that we're training for war against, and so let's joke about Malays and and 2 years of indoctrination in that, right, for all the rest of us. And the other thing that really amazed me, this happened long after I ORD'd. A taxi driver told me that he dropped off a new mainland Chinese migrant to the Sungai Gedong armor camp. Okay. And this mainland Chinese migrant was like making some jokes about Malays and all that with the taxi driver lah. But the funny thing for me is it got me thinking. We always say that the reason for not having Muslims in some of these quote unquote high security or whatever departments is because of war lah, right? In case we fight Malaysia, are they going to switch sides or whatever? But it's so ridiculous because every Malay I know is totally committed to Singapore. And if you think about a new Chinese migrant, right, getting higher security clearance than a Malay whose family has been here for generations, and a lot of the new migrants, my cousin, because he grew up here, he had to do army, and then he's gone back to Australia. He's an Australian citizen. It's the same for a lot of people, Chinese and Indians and all that, who come to Singapore, right? They might actually kena do army, but then they end up going back to their home country. This is a common trend, right, in Singapore today. So can you imagine how ridiculous it is that we might actually allow, example, a new Chinese immigrant who might actually end up going to China. We give this person higher security clearance than a Malay whose family has been here for generations.
Recently got the Singaporean guy who's spying for China also.
James Bond,
the Singaporean guy.
Dixon
So not even waiting for people from other countries. Okay, so
all these policies are whatever the intent and whatever the the value in the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
I think they far outlived their value. We just need to look at them again.
But then just based on what you just said, right, where you were in a unit where there were no Malay or Muslims, and in that sort of climate, you and maybe other Chinese people were making jokes about them, right? So
I wasn't.
okay.
But I must.
Anti-establishment content creator.
But you know, like a lot of ethnic stereotype jokes, I'm sure I laughed at all of them.
Yeah.
I'm sure I
guilty of
did.
that. Yeah,
I'm sure I
guilty of
did.
that. So sorry for mislabeling or mischaracterizing you. But what I was getting at, right? So on one hand, what you're saying is that because there was no ethnic group represented, it made it easier for the other ethnic groups to kind of poke fun at them. But isn't that what CMIO prevents? So if you're saying you want to take out CMIO, I'm generally maybe not as optimistic as you, because I feel like without structures in place, people will self-segregate, and that might cause more problems. Not to say that I believe in CMIO. I think it needs to evolve. But just those two situations you gave are kind of like, how do you grapple with that? On one hand, you're saying we don't want buckets and we see everyone equal. But on one hand, where there was a clear issue of one race being excluded and the circumstances of that not being good, isn't that kind of contradictory?
Yeah, so I suspect that countries with a very heavy top-down model like Singapore and countries with a very completely laissez-faire bottom-up model like what France and Portugal have, they will have to move towards each other lah.
Okay.
So I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Is it complete tomorrow eradication of CMIO and we don't count by race anymore? I don't think that's the answer lah.
Okay.
Right? Because we still might need to make assessments of social economic status by race. You know, and if you say don't count race at all anymore, there are problems as well, as is evident in Western Europe today. Right? They are unable to get a grip on racism against certain groups because they don't look at race. So I think it's more about that, you know, this has to come together in some form lah.
Okay.
Singapore now, I think it's too top down, too heavy and too harsh lah.
So is there I think this was something I wanted to ask was, is there a country or that has a model that you think is the closest, is the best so far, like the ideal in terms of handling racial issues and racial equity and everything? Because we know Singapore is one extreme and then France, for example, might be another extreme. But is there somewhere you should aspire to?
No, in terms of their ethnic models of identity, right? Whether it's top-down identity formation or bottom-up, I don't know of one that's an ideal. You know, I don't know of one that's an ideal. And I think to some degree it's quite country specific. You just need to come up with something that works for your country. And obviously, you know, a global city is going to have very different requirements from a much bigger country where you have people spread out and segregated in different ways. But what I will say as a response to that, and several people have also asked me what's a good model, I do like, in terms of racism, just addressing racism, the issue of racism, I do like what Canada has done over the past few years. So Canada actually has a very clear anti-racism strategy that's at a very high level, and they've got two ministers. One is, I think, called Minister of Diversity and Inclusion. The other one is called Minister of Heritage and Multiculturalism. So they actually have very senior positions. They've got an anti-racism secretariat. And it's the result of you know, it's kind of, I think, a year-long consultation with citizens. So, you know, I think something like that is very useful for Singapore to consider. It's very useful for many multicultural societies to consider, because it basically, at a very high level, says this is a problem. We acknowledge it's a problem, and we're going to address it.
Ours is we generally have it under the Ministry of Social and Family. What was it? MSF.
MSCCY? No. MSF.
MSF lah, right? Yeah. They handle these issues under MSF. Unless it becomes a law issue, then it's under Ministry of Home Affairs and all that lah. But we don't have an anti-racism ministry.
And I think it's useful to consider it. Now it gets a bad name in the States, right? Because I don't know if you've heard of this this author called Robin DiAngelo, and she wrote a book called White Fragility, and she's done a lot of anti-racism training or training based off a book, and the one that really made it to the news last year was the Coca-Cola training. I don't know if you guys saw that.
No.
So there was Coca-Cola training, and one of the maxims was try to be less white. and what does being less white mean? Being less white means being less arrogant, being less this, being less that. So it was essentially
That's racism. Right?
It was this kind of anti-racism. So it's like an indictment of whiteness, and so that was an example actually right there. This anti-racism training that happened in Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
People all over the world making fun of it. They were like, this is wokedom and leftism gone crazy, right, in America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the very phrase anti-racism sometimes gets a bad name because of incidents like this.
Yeah.
But I think it's still important that we think about a program along those lines, because that's how we need to think about combating racism lah.
So to that, I mean, am I right to say that in some way is a shitty example of critical race theory? Because my understanding of critical race theory is embedding in these sort of trainings some element of the racial inequality lah. Or am I totally off?
I mean, it's become anything that I think the critical race theory came about in the 70s and 80s through legal scholars who were looking at the way race affects institutions and affects people through institutions. Now, D'Angelo's anti-racism training, I think to some effect, to some extent, she is trying to address institutional racism through these things. But I don't think it's a easy parallel to addressing things that come out of CRT lah.
Okay.
So what she's doing.
But then what are your thoughts on the use of terms like white fragility, white privilege? And now they're using Chinese privilege, Chinese fragility to as for people to argue back on the internet. And
Sorry,
all.
just to finish off that train of thought, which is related,
Sure.
it's I think this anti-racism training, especially with this whiteness thing, is more about addressing unconscious bias, right, and unconscious privilege.
Yeah.
Whereas critical race theory perhaps is a broader thing about how race plays with institutions to affect people's opportunities and discrimination and things like that.
The reason I brought it up is like, I mean, what we spoke about in the last podcast when we were going down the rabbit hole of what critical race theory is, now it's a lot more relevant because Biden has kind of signed an initiative for it to be incorporated in schools like in the US. And a lot of parents are now like, in certain states are pushing back. I think the governor of Florida banned critical race theory integration into schools because what I understand is that instead of, like growing up, you have the John, Ali and Muthu has a bunch of marbles and you have, the problem is about math lah. But critical race theory, if you want to incorporate it, it would account for these sort of racial discriminations into these sort of educational frameworks lah. So that's why when you were saying that part of the anti-racism training for her included stuff like declaring, the privilege here and all, it sounded to me like, is that critical race theory in a very bad shape lah. So I think that was like that's what's happening in the US, which is quite interesting because you get pushback from both sides lah. Some people are saying, I know I just watched a video on Fox News earlier today, submitted by one of our Redditors, about a person who grew up under Chairman Mao in China, who came out and said that critical race theory is horrible because it's exactly what happened in China, and it was the downfall of the. I mean, it kind of suppressed a lot of people based on class, not race. But she's saying she's seeing the same stuff happening in the US now, which is why critical race theory cannot be in class. And I was like, oh shit, this is like a new problem that the US is confronting.
Yeah. I don't know enough about how it's being applied. Actually,
I think it's
in
a new thing.
classrooms.
It's a new thing now. But yeah, then your question was...
Well, your thoughts on the use of terms like white privilege and white fragility being transplanted to describe the issues here, like Chinese privilege, Chinese fragility. I mean, I see that a lot on the internet mostly.
Chinese privilege is Terrence's favorite phrase.
No, I have my issues with it but I wanted to hear what Sudhir thinks
So I think there is something around Chinese privilege in Singapore.
Yeah.
And so that lady on the MRT, is a very good example because I think if the races were flipped,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have panned out that way at all.
Correct. Yeah.
So there's something about the fact that she was a Chinese lady, and sorry for repeating what I said on my last podcast, but for the listeners of this podcast, I think a Chinese lady was harassing minority men essentially, right? On the MRT train.
Correct. Yeah.
And she was making YouTube videos of it for many years.
Yeah.
And nothing happened.
Yeah.
But if the races were flipped, I think it's very obvious if it was a minority lady harassing Chinese men on the train. There's no way. There's no way her channel would have even lasted 2 weeks, lah. Okay, so I think this idea that there is some embedded privilege for the majority in Singapore, I think it's quite clear from what I see. Now whether I want to use the word Chinese privilege, I'm a bit hesitant for that very reason, lah. That it's the term white privilege has become a bit of a hackneyed term for some people, and then if you just use Chinese privilege, then it's like, you're just blindly importing the concept from America. Very clearly, the racial dynamics in America are totally different from racial dynamics here, with their long history of slavery. And I don't think anybody blindly imports anything, in terms of critical race theory or in terms of understanding of structural racism in Singapore. I don't think there's any blind importation. So the danger for me with using the phrase Chinese privilege is that you get painted into a corner, lah, right? Or you're just mimicking white privilege. That's my only worry. Not that I don't think that it doesn't exist. I think it does exist.
Yeah.
I'm just worried about how we label it.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely there's an advantage being a part of the majority in any kind of group, lah, right? You walk into any place. If I were to go to, I go to the US, I'm a minority, lah, right? And I get my fair share of racist attacks and all that as well. But like similar to what you're saying, I feel the word privilege, just the word privilege itself is so loaded, versus a word like even an advantage. The example you're saying, like, imagine you play tennis and instead of Federer, advantage Federer, you say privilege Federer, just to score. It just sounds, there's an aspect of it feeling very unearned, like an unearned kind of advantage that you get,
Yeah.
But if that's precisely what we are trying to address, that's what we're trying to talk about. But I just feel the word just carries so much baggage of it in terms of the image of privilege being like, Jabba the Hutt fat cat sitting on a throne kind of thing, and lording over everyone else.
And it's like sour grapes. I mean, not sour grapes. It's people who do not benefit from that privilege will find it a very weird term, lah. There are a lot of low-income Singaporean Chinese. There are a lot of disenfranchised Singaporean Chinese. I mean, the concept of Chinese privilege must be bizarre to them, which is the same thing as it is in America for low-income whites.
But the thing is, like what you said, the racial relations between white people and black people in the US and all that. I mean, literally slavery, right? Literally, Jabba the Hutt is sitting on a throne and whipping people. Versus what it is in Singapore between the majority here, Chinese people, and the minorities. It's a very different racial dynamic also. So my thought is always about labeling it as privilege, Chinese privilege, like that. So I don't have a better term for it. So I totally agree that being the majority, you are blind to certain advantages that you have, and you must do your best to acknowledge them. And like I said, COVID-19 is showing you must take care of the slowest, even the slowest member of the slowest person in the race. You have to take care of them and make sure everyone gets past the finish line together. But it's just the use of the word. It's been weaponized so much that it becomes almost like you say, hackneyed, and people just you can just conveniently say, you copy from the West,
So I think the end outcome of our discussion is that the government needs to form a racial task force, administer like racial tests. Because I mean, just now at one point you were saying,
wait, sorry, can I just hold one second?
Yeah.
I just had one comment on his.
Sure, yeah.
So very quickly, somebody, I've got a white South African friend who's married to an Indian South African. He told me that it's not just Chinese privilege here, but it's also white privilege here. Right?
Yeah.
He told me, and it's very clear. So his wife's
Yeah.
Indian. He said it's very clear when they walk into restaurants
Yeah.
or they walk into shops.
Yeah.
If he walks in first, the level of attention and care that they get,
Yeah.
as opposed to when his wife walks in. So they're different forms of privilege in Singapore.
correct.
It's certainly not just Chinese privilege.
But I mean, you examine the history. I mean, they were our colonial masters at one point. I mean, Chinese people were coolies and everything also lah. So if I mean, just looking at that, if the word white privilege is used to describe the kind of relationship between the a white person and races here, I would kind of like, okay, I see some similarities in that. Although it was a very long time ago lah. But just the Chinese privilege thing itself, I'm still grappling with it, and it's it's still something I still like. Then let's try and find a term to talk about this because I feel it's just been weaponized to the point of it's almost a caricature.
But
already.
maybe like what Sudhir said, like even between us we have our differences, but there's a big issue to tackle. lah. And I think right now just looking at discussions online feels like, because the big topic is so hard to tackle, it feels like the conversations will focus on these other issues around it, and nothing's really changing lah. Because that's what I feel. Unfortunately, after all these repeated incidences, like part of me is like, oh my god, what the hell is going on? Maybe it really is like COVID. Like the stance right now is COVID will be with us forever. Don't hope they'll ever go away. Maybe that's the same approach we need to take with racism lah. Which is like what you said also, right? Instead of just hoping for this one utopia where everybody in Singapore gets along, no, they'll be fucking racist. And I think it'll be great if people coming into Singapore, people being born primary one, the first thing is like, okay, guys, there are racist people out there. Like Singapore is not perfect. We should try and get along, but there'll be racists out there, and it's the duty of every Singaporean to call out these racists regardless of race. That's why I think the pledge really needs to be updated, like Pledge 2.0 or something, to factor all this in, so that we're not blindsided by the fact that, we got racial harmony means, I'm harmonious with all races. Because to me, that sort of stuff is just pointless. And to me, it boggles my mind that it's still going on these days, right? 31st July is Racial Harmony Day or something, right? What the hell is that going to look like this year, yeah?
Hey, but can I just point out one thing? That's actually when I saw what Shanmugam replied about that whole racial incident, right? That whole interracial dating thing, I didn't think immediately that it was like, you so stupid, man, kind of reply. In fact, I was thinking, wow, I mean, here's the Minister of Law, who, when he comes out and talks, shit happens, shit happens to a lot of people involved. So I didn't think that what he said particularly made light of it, lah. So I just wanted to find out, is this my majority advantage talking or what?
you know my thoughts on that, because we did talk about it on the podcast.
Go ahead.
My thought was that it did make light. It was a bit oblivious to what the on the ground sentiment is, and it boggled my mind that he could just be so surprised, lah. And this was a debate that we had on our own podcast, it ended at that, both of us having those sentiments. But what was your sentiments about? About that thing? I know you alluded to it just now a bit earlier, but
he said he agrees with it.
And I think they just have to address the history of the party and Lee Kuan Yew lah. They can't keep sidestepping it. I'm sorry, it's
Also, you're saying because he obviously is part of the ruling party, and it was the founder of the ruling party had such strong views about
actually
certain
Shanmugam
things.
was there by his side. Right?
Shanmugam was there, So the fact that he is surprised.
And I mean, it's like what Tan Boon Lee said to Dave Prakash, right? You're talking about Shanmugam's response to that, right?
Yeah.
What Tan Boon Lee said to Dave Prakash, I mean, was eerily similar to some things that Lee Kuan Yew has said in the past, lah. And there were memes going around about Lee Kuan Yew's quote after that. If my daughter brought back a guy from another race, how would you feel? And I wrote a piece on this that contextualized Lee Kuan Yew's comments in a broader context. But still, it's just ironic that Shanmugam goes up there and, acts surprised about that. Maybe he is. And my first response is, haven't you read Lee Kuan Yew's words? Don't you draw a line between Lee Kuan Yew's words and somebody like Tan Boon Lee, which was made even stronger when Tan Boon Lee's former Malay Muslim student came up with that post. Even stronger now, you're like, oh, I really see the ghost of Lee Kuan Yew in Tan Boon Lee, man.
Okay.
So, I mean, for me, we're like scratching at the edges. The PAP is scratching at the edges, unless it addresses the elephant in the room, lah.
And do you think
do
you think it will be? Because I'm with you on that also. That I think it needs to be addressed. Do you think it will be something the government will address? Do you think a media outlet would address it, or you think it's up to the citizen voices?
You and me, bro.
That's what I was getting at, bro.
No, so there's a very clear political reason why they are so afraid, in my view, to address Lee Kuan Yew's legacy. So let's look. There are many things, but let's just look at two big things. One is how Lee Kuan Yew dealt with his political opponents, right? So the arrests of the communists, so-called communists in the 60s, arrests of the so-called Marxists in the 80s, right? Plus how he dealt with racism, racism, etc. There must be a lot of fear in addressing his legacy because it cuts to the very heart of the party. It cuts to the very heart of the foundation of Singapore, right? But I think our society is much more mature than people give us credit for, right? Current leaders give us credit for. I think we can handle this kind of introspection, this kind of discourse. But my suspicion is they're never going to do it themselves because they are just afraid, of where that introspection leads.
Yeah. But do you think the opposition will?
The opposition has already. So if you look at, and they do so regularly. So certainly on issues around political opponents, they have many times.
Yeah.
Around issues of racism, if you look at Pritam Singh's
recent post,
yeah, he mentioned Lee Kuan Yew's message as well, and he very beautifully brought out the contradictions in Lee Kuan Yew's policies, right? Because, like I said, he had racist views, he had racist policies, but he did strive to build a race-neutral meritocracy.
Yeah.
Your parents grew up and lived here and succeeded here. So did my parents. Many minorities people succeeded in the country Lee Kuan Yew built. Are my parents complicit in the quote-unquote racist system that Lee Kuan Yew built? Maybe, right? Why didn't my parents' generation complain more about the racism? I don't know. They had their own battles to fight. But maybe now it's time for us to look at some of these issues. But, I think we're not given enough credit that we as a society are at the point, and I think we've been at the point for many years where we can handle a mature debate on these issues. And have the debate, move on, or decide, okay, we want to change some policies. And then move on, not pretend like it never happened and sweep everything under the carpet, which is and then ultimately just blame everything on individual cocks lah. That's our favorite lah. So this is the great irony about racism. For all those years when everything was kept under tap, right? There's nothing, no big racist incidents. The party kept co-opting all the credit, right? It's because of us. It's because of our wonderful micromanagement of racial relations, CMIO system, HDB quota. It's because of us. Singapore is a multiracial paradise, right? Now when incidents come up, individual cocks, nothing to do with that. So exactly. it's quite smart lah. The way they frame all these incidents and negate the influence of Lee Kuan Yew.
But actually, it might be something that we might dissect in the future lah. Because even now, we've been talking for what? 2.5 hours.
Almost 2.5.
2.5 hours on the topic of race.
Yeah.
And I think we have addressed a lot of the things that were sent to us via Reddit and all that. So any any final questions? Any final thoughts?
Final question from I've seen this around.
Yeah.
As a majority advantaged person, what can I do to help the situation when something like
Well,
that
I'm going to need
happens?
another 2 more hours. Okay.
No, I mean, just practical steps that can be taken right now. I sent a support message to Harish recently, but then he.
You want me to read it
asked
out?
me- I was following Wake Up Singapore.
Fucking hell, he just sent me a message. I think Wake Up Singapore had a thing, send a message to a minority friend and tell them that you are
You're
there for them. lah.
Yeah.
So Terrence sent me and our producer friend
Who's Eurasian,
Yeah,
yeah.
who is in a Eurasian in a WhatsApp group. He's like, guys, I just want you to let you all know that I'm here for you. Hashtag call it out SG. And my other friend didn't respond. I told Terrence to fuck off.
Yeah.
So
then tell me what to do then. Tell me what to do.
No, so I guess that one thing when you that initially when we were thinking about talking about Boon Lee, and I know you said that okay, this guy is obviously a racist. He's not representative of all Chinese people.
Yeah.
So what's the point? Because there will always be racist people in Singapore. And then a few days later you realize, oh shit, that was basically a smoke of a big fire that had been burning for years. And I'm glad you had that realization because I remember I had to try and tell you why we had to talk about it. And I think even for me, like when we were talking about that, part of me was like, do I want to talk about this? It's just the same old fucking shit. But I'm glad we did because I think that's one thing that people can do. If you feel yourself getting apathetic and all that, apathetic, however the fuck you pronounce that, just and if you feel like you read some comment, you're like, that guy's a fucking idiot, or you don't agree, maybe just try and push back and talk to people about it. Talk to your friends, talk to people who might be able to share a bit more of a perspective rather than just push it aside. Because it's so easy to look for the easy solution, like what Sudhir said, or to push it aside. But also question. Because I think it's important everybody kind of look at it, not just, okay, everything is level 5. And just be aware of that. So that's one thing for me. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Sudhir.
I think it's such an important question. Many of my friends actually sent me something similar on private chat and all that.
Oh, really?
They're like, what can we do to help? How can we be an ally? So there's this concept of allyship is very important. And again, I don't think there are easy answers. But there are some things. So for example, you and just to back up a bit, I have many Chinese friends for the past 2 years who are like now walking on eggshells, right? They're so afraid that they're going to say something that might offend somebody else in some way, or so they don't know what to do,
Yeah.
And I think some simple things that can be done, so for example, firstly, have friends from different races. I know not everybody has that.
Hey, racial harmony, bro. Everybody has friends. Everybody has friends.
But and this is not just Chinese. I know Indians and Malays as well who mostly keep to themselves. But I think it's very important if you're living in a multicultural society to have friends of different races and religions.
Yeah.
And so if I asked you now, Terrence, like you don't have to answer, but I'm just saying you should have on your speed dial, on your WhatsApp or whatever. If I'm in a situation where I don't know if this is offensive to a Eurasian. Okay, there's a Mr. Rodriguez or a Mr. De Silva that I can straight away ask lah.
Yep.
But most actually I don't know, but I hazard to guess that most Singaporeans don't have that, right?
So you need like a CMIO speed dial.
Yeah.
Right.
You need a CMIO speed dial. Get your bloody
The CMIO Avengers that you call on for help anytime.
Avengers assemble. Get on video call, everybody. Hey, yeah, actually,
yeah. So I mean that and it's something I use frequently. I use it frequently. I ask my Malay friends and my Indian friends and my Eurasian friends, hey, is it okay to say this? Is that the right way to, it's because it's a complex world. I mean,
So
that's a
that sounds
simple
like an
thing,
app idea. You sign up, you immediately get
Pair you with-
group you up.
Yeah.
Dude, it's
we
the
start that,
CMIO
I'm
app.
sure you can get some big grant from GovTech
Yeah,
and
exactly.
maybe the People's Association.
Yeah,
They must be willing to sponsor this.
Quota got quota, not every group. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why.
Wow, that'd be
Then it checks your
fantastic.
trace together. If you go too much to Little India, they realize, okay, you got Indian. You probably like then you need to pair you up and all that.
Yeah.
Okay. But
yeah,
that's a bit. Yeah, that's a huge step. Like, what's like a little step for someone who maybe is listening to this and they think, okay, maybe I should. Wow, to get a CMIO speed dial is a bit hard. Should I read something? Should I listen to something? Should I any small step, like a baby step? And not just to majority, because I've met people of Indian ethnicity, Malay ethnicity. Sometimes I feel also like, do I really want to care about this? Fuck this shit. There's so much other things to worry about. What's a baby step?
Baby step is just to have your ears open and listen to what's going on and be ready to potentially point out racist or prejudice when you see it, like racism or prejudice when you see it among the people around you.
Even like older family,
Older family,
aunties, uncles.
yeah, so I mean, one of the common questions is, this intergenerational question. It was okay for our parents, how come it's not okay now? I think unfortunately we have to go through that long conversation that we did that racism is not fixed, it changes.
Yeah.
Changes from I think you need to have that conversation that there's no other there's no short way there's no easy fix so I think
Send them a link to this podcast lah.
And SudhirTV.
And SudhirTV, yeah.
TV.com.
But I think that's important to have the conversations with people around you. For people who are trying to be allies. Not everybody is, but people are trying to be allies. I think that's the best you can do. Start with small conversations. Start with small comments that you see on your social media feed. If somebody is saying something that's actually quite racially provocative, maybe tell them, hey, is there a different way to...
Or block them entirely.
Block them entirely, cancel completely. That's a whole other 1 hour conversation about whether... No, it's important about whether censorship and legislation and, is the way to deal with these things. I think that's a very important, we can leave this for another episode,
sure.
but I think it's an important question.
Yeah.
Is that the best way to
That is a whole other episode.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Is that the best way to deal with racism by charging people by what's the name of the guy with the satirical Twitter account? Was it
Sharon Liu.
Sharon Liu.
Yeah.
Is that the best way to deal with these issues? I think it's a whole other episode. But
Yeah. So how has my majority friend? Are you going to work towards building up a CMIO speed dial?
I already have already. What makes you think I don't have?
You got already,
yeah.
Am I an Indian person?
Yeah. I think you're the Indian person.
Okay, you think.
But then the thing is that you're quite like, oh, I don't do this, I don't do that, I don't do that.
Like what?
You sort of dissociate yourself from tradition and culture.
Where got such thing? Anyhow,
I'm so modern,
You give example. Just now you asked me to back up my claim that PA was fucking stupid. Give an example.
The example.
Or that I step away from.
You're not very religious, right?
But why does religion is it so closely tied to ethnicity?
Generally a lot of mostly ethnic Indians are also Hindu or they practice one of the religions, right? But you don't at all, right?
I mean, I'm born Hindu. I still do Hindu stuff.
I know, but you're not a reliable person to ask about certain.
But I am a
traditions
type of Indian, right?
Yeah.
You know what your stereotypical? Okay, must do Bharatanatyam, must speak Hindi, must do.
So you are a 1A lah. You're a 1A lah. But I have a B C D E F in case that.
So the
fails,
first point is CMIO. Then after that,
Yeah.
you can have within the I different types of I, different types of O's and all.
Yeah, I've actually put a lot of effort to try to understand the different segments within the Indian population as well, in terms of Malayali versus Sindhi and everything. And sometimes I also hear even your own, when you describe them, like there's certain stereotypes also, right? And then I just listen very, very accordingly and I try to understand better. Because honestly, for Chinese people, it was easier last time, but now much harder to really differentiate, like, Teochew or Hokkien or anything like that. Back then, there was like clans and all that nonsense that everyone would do, like the different activities you would do. But now it's just everyone's just Chinese and then that's all.
But that's an important thing for people, an easy thing for people to do. Is to understand the granularity of China, India, and the Malay world. So
That's why I watched
Malaysia,
Indian,
Indonesia.
Indian Matchmaker.
I didn't want to bring it up. Everything he says now, right, is from that 8 episodes. His whole fucking concept of India and the culture is Indian matchmaking.
I say already, not-
Seema from Bombay is your
Not just
teacher.
that.
Yeah,
It's
Seema.
that plus Delhi crime also. Yeah, and then you understand. And then 3 Idiots also, if you can
And
afford
3
the time.
idiots, yeah. 3 idiots. But yeah, like
Wow.
I think that was a very hearty discussion.
Yeah.
Shall we do the One Shiok thing?
Yes, we should.
Do you have your One Shiok thing, Sudhir?
No, you all go first.
okay.
I forgot about the one shot thing.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, I mean, I know that sounded like an abrupt segue, but it is a lot that we have covered. We are going to be answering questions on Reddit, so please comment away. And if there's enough, we might do another episode. We might do a Ask Me Anything. We might do a whole series on race.
Yeah.
All right, so keep that in mind. But now we just end off with something a little more lighthearted. The One Shiok thing of the week, of the past few days. You have yours, Terrence?
I mean, I think I talked about the trailer the last round, but the first episode of Loki, the latest Marvel superhero movie starring a straight white villain, straight white hero. But I mean, it's just as entertainment. I think Marvel, Disney / Marvel has been doing a very good job building on the gigantic universe that they did with the movies. But I feel the television series actually are more interesting. They take more risks with the television series.
So it matched the hype, because the trailer was fucking awesome.
Yeah, there's a vibe about the show that really brings you back to those kind of, heist movies or the 70s movies that you're watching. So it's interesting. It's interesting. And I mean, Tom Hiddleston is a very charming actor, everything. So
How about WandaVision? Did you watch that?
yeah, WandaVision also was like, they took a lot of risks with
Very
that, I felt.
interesting, man.
Yeah, I mean,
Storytelling is very interesting.
Yeah, and they, I mean, 3 episodes where you really didn't know what the fuck was happening. How often does that happen?
Yeah.
Like, they dared to do it, and knowing that most people drop off after the first or second episode, they went 3 episodes with like you not knowing what the hell's going on. So I salute them for taking a risk, even though they're such a big, multi-billion-dollar organization. So it's worth checking out. Yeah.
Cool. My One Shiok thing is also a TV show. It's a show called Sweet Home on Netflix. It's a Korean show, and I remember it's a Korean series, and I remember watching the trailer a few months ago. It's about this one guy who moves into this like crumbling apartment building, and there's a monster infestation. And it's all set within that one apartment block. The trailer was awesome. And I thought I read reviews about how it's actually not that good, but I decided, let me just watch one episode. And I watched it last night, and it was fucking great, man. And I always feel like when there's this monster series, how many more iterations can they do to still keep it engaging? I had that feeling when I watched Kingdom, and that turned out great. And this is another Korean show set in modern day times, but it's just so eerie, but in a good way. And I watched one episode, and I think it's amazing. It's really good. Yeah.
What's the name again?
Sweet Home.
Sweet Home.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting. Yeah.
Sudhir.
Sudhir,
Yeah,
over to
I
you.
got mine. I got
Bring
mine.
some positivity.
I got mine.
Yeah.
I really loved the opening ceremony of the Euro 2020.
Oh, really?
So
There was with a live crowd and everything, a ceremony.
yeah.
Oh, wow.
So those who don't follow football, the reason it's still called Euro 2020 is supposed to be held last year. Because of COVID. It was postponed, so it's held this year, but they still kept the name.
Yeah.
And I think they kept the name partly, as a show of resilience. And the opening ceremony for me also was this, they had amazing, especially the last part. So, sort of 5-6 minutes of it where they had Andrea Bocelli singing this beautiful opera song. I think it's called Nessun Dorma.
Yeah.
And then they had incredible balloons and this ballerina spinning around, and actually fireworks. I love fireworks and I love flares. So those flares that you see football fans lighting as they stand with all the colors inside the stadium, right? So they combine the flares with the fireworks on the top of the Rome Stadium, and it just looked so beautiful, and it was just such a almost like victory of the human spirit despite the very difficult 18 months that the whole world has had, that they actually managed to bring this event together and host it.
Oh, really? Yeah. And you can see it online, like just the opening ceremony?
You can see just the opening ceremony. I'll share the link with you guys.
Yeah.
Well, Andrea Bocelli, I think this whole COVID period, he has been he is the face of resilience against COVID. Because you don't,
I didn't know. I only seen.
Oh,
He's
you
done
did-
other. He's done other stuff.
no, like the midst of the crisis in 2020,
Yeah.
they, all the streets in Italy were cleared out, and then
Yeah.
they filmed a special of him singing a song in the empty streets in front of a giant cathedral. So it's like, I mean, he's blind and all, right? He walks up to the spot and then he starts, his operatic voice, he starts singing Ave Maria, and then they show the scenes of the streets being empty and just reminding people that, in spite of all this, there's still beauty in everything.
Yeah.
And then over Christmas, I was live streaming this also. It was very fun. So they went to some caves with those giant, what do you call it?
Stalagmites.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they got him in the middle of the cave and he was singing in there, and because there was no audience or anything, but this was his Christmas special lah. So he was singing in the cave with a dancer, dancing in the pool.
Oh.
And so it was just like, again, it was like, wow, this guy, he's blind and he's in the middle of a cave, and they made the
Nice.
cave so beautiful and there's nobody. And
You know what would be horrible if they told him, yeah, there's a lot of audience. Yeah, the whole thing is packed.
wait, before I laugh, let me check whether that was
Yeah, I also was
offensive,
thinking,
lah.
fuck, was that insensitive? Was I trivializing the whole thing? Yeah.
No, but it's really every time he comes on, I feel like, wow, got that triumph of the human spirit feel. Alright,
Still
check
thinking,
yourself. Check yourself.
oh shit. Still thinking, fuck.
But I'll go check that one out.
Okay,
You
yeah,
wrote
but,
that,
yeah, but this opening segment is
Addendum
like
to my, what is it? One best thing.
one shock thing.
Oh, one shock thing.
One shock thing. It don't be Western now. One best thing. One
Sorry.
shock thing.
Sorry,
okay?
sorry. One shock
One
thing.
shock thing. Local shock thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. But yeah, that was 2 hours and 40 minutes. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Mr. Sudhir.
Thank you.
I know this won't be the last podcast we do together.
Yeah.
And if you're listening to this, if you have lasted this long, thank you for listening.
And where can we find you again on the internet? Just
I'll
quick
share.
shout.
Yeah.
No, I mean-
SudhirTV.com
Yep.
and Facebook, Sudhir.Vadaketh. Twitter, IG, SudhirTV.
Okay. And Vadaketh is Vadaketh.
Yep.
Okay.
Awesome.
Great. All right. And to all those listening, thank you so much and talk to y'all soon.